Olá, boa tarde. É com enorme satisfação que nós damos sequência ao nosso ciclo de seminários envolvendo as águas transfronteiriças e hoje para trabalharmos aí um dos temas da maior relevância, que é justamente os conflitos envolvendo a região da Jordânia, que é historicamente uma das áreas onde o tema da água, em especial a água transfronteiriça, é de fato muito importante. E para isso temos o prazer de receber o professor Hussam Hussein, que estará conosco para fazer sua apresentação da Universidade de Oxford. Professor, é um prazer estar com você aqui. E eu convido agora a Isabela Espíndola, que vai coordenar nossos trabalhos.
Thank you, Professor Wagner. So, welcome everyone to our webinar series. In this episode, we receive Professor Hussam from the University of Oxford to discuss about water governance politics of water scarcity in the case of Jordan, as Professor Wagner mentioned. Before we start our session and before presenting Professor Hussam, I would like to remember that the past webinars are all available at our YouTube channel. So remember to watch, comment, and share among your peers. Also, to inform you that although we don't have live translations, we are working to translate the subtitles from English or Spanish to Portuguese and vice versa to ensure that this fantastic content that we have here is available to a bigger and diverse audience. And finally, I would like to express my thanks to everyone that has been attending and participating in our webinars and to our institutional support. So to the Institute of Advanced Studies, to the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development, to the São Paulo Research Foundation, to the Federal University of Bahia, and to the University of São Paulo. And don't forget to follow GEOPO social media to stay tuned for updates regarding the webinar series and other works that are done by the laboratory. And I believe that the links will be shared shortly in the chat and in the video. And if you have any questions regarding Professor Hussam's presentation, just add it to the chat that we will collect everything and pass in the final part of the webinar. And without any other delay, I would like to present Professor Hussam. And he is a department lecturer in international relations at the Department of Politics and International Relations. And he's also an Oxford Martin Fellow in Water Diplomacy. He's a member of the Middle East Center and a Fulford Junior Research Fellow at Somerville College. And he's a member of the leadership team of the Oxford Water Network. His principal research interests are concerned with the role of discourse in shaping water policies in the Middle East, about transboundary water governance, critical hydropolitics, and the political economy of water resources in arid and semi-arid regions. He is the author of several articles of water politics, and his work has appeared on several academic journals, including GeoForum, Mediterranean Politics, a Contemporary Relevant Water International, Water Policy, and Water Alternatives. And Professor Hussein is the principal investigator of the John Fell-funded project Analyzing Changing Transboundary Freshwater Agreements, which investigates the role of the political context in answering how and why transboundary freshwater agreements change over time. He is also funded program of the Transboundary Resource Management at the Oxford Martin School, which is exploring the scope for transboundary cooperation on natural resource management in the Eastern Nile River Basin and the Jordan River Basin. And Dr. Hussein has had fellowships at the American University of Beirut, at the University of Kassel, and he is currently fellow of the Young Academy of Sustainability at the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Studies. He obtained his PhD from the School of International Development from the University of East Anglia, and his thesis was about the discourse of water scarcity in the case of Jordan. He obtained his BA and MA in International Relations and Diplomacy from the University of Trieste in Italy, and he studied Middle East studies at SOAS University of London. And Professor Hussein, this stage is yours, and you have around 30 to 40 minutes for your presentation. Professor, you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here today online and speak about water politics in Jordan. I believe you can all see my screen. So I will start. So the presentation today is on the topic of the politics of water scarcity in the case of Jordan. The research problem, meaning the Jordan's water scarcity, is very important, this region, the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, is the most water scarce region in the world, and that's why I decided to look at the issue of water scarcity within this webinar series that looks at transboundary water issues and water politics across the world. So Jordan is the second most water scarce country in the world. The problem, the challenge that Jordan faces is, I believe, very complex and looks at different, comes from different dimensions and directions. Firstly, I believe that Jordan's groundwater resources, which are obviously very important, as we will see today, are decreasing in terms of both quantity and quality due to overuse and over abstraction and extraction of these water resources. We have a situation where about a third of the population is formed by refugees. So as a result of regional instability, Jordan is hosting millions of refugees, as well as a situation where about 90% of the food products consumed in the country are imported, while about 50% of Jordan's water supply goes to agriculture. So I think that's quite of an interesting broad picture just to contextualize our challenge. Those reasons that I just mentioned are the reasons why I decided to try to investigate and better understand why we have this current situation of environmental degradation when it comes to groundwater resources, challenges on the growing population, as well as the issue of how to ensure food security. And therefore, I wanted and I decided to try to investigate the political economy of the Jordanian water sector by using discourses and narratives and discourses, so discursive hydropolitics as an entry point to try to unpack the political economy of the water sector of the country. So the discourse that I focused on, as we will see, is water scarcity, meaning, and the reason why I looked at water scarcity is really because it allows me to unpack and understand the different challenges that contribute to the formation of water scarcity. And the goal, obviously, of my research, coming from political science and development studies, is really to try to make a positive change, both in terms of research to the literature, but also to try to support improving the policies in the country, and therefore to increase the water security and sustainability of the water sector in the country. So I was mentioning the environmental aspect of the environmental degradation. As we can see in this slide, this is a picture, 3 pictures of the Dead Sea, which is at the border between Jordan and on the eastern side, and Israel and Palestine on the eastern side. And the interesting aspect is that due to diversions and overuse and building and construction of dams, especially on the tributaries going into the Jordan River, we have a situation where the flow of the lower part of the Jordan River has decreased by about 97% in the past 60 years, more or less. This has also resulted, obviously, in a reduction of the biodiversity living in the area by about 50%. the surface of the Dead Sea has also decreased by already 1/3, and the level of the Dead Sea is decreasing by about 1 meter per year. So that's really the environmental degradation when it comes to the Dead Sea and also to the lower part of the Jordan River. And it really adds to what I was saying about groundwater resources, which are also decreasing, especially, I mean, across the whole country, but I would say especially in the northern part of the country. In this slide, we can see a bit of transboundary issues, which is obviously very, very important for both for Jordan, but also for our webinar series. Here I decided to show the map of Jordan, obviously a country in the Middle East, as we all know, situating it within the dimensions of transboundary water resources, which are important because, as we can see, 40% of water resources in Jordan are of transboundary nature, meaning they're shared with neighboring countries. So we can see that Jordan borders in the north with Syria, on the west side with the West Bank, Palestine, and Israel, and in the east with Iraq in the northern part and Saudi Arabia in the southern part, as well as in the eastern and southern part. And the 3 years that I put are very important because they are the years when we have agreements on transboundary issues between Jordan and its neighboring countries. So in the northern part, we have the Yarmouk River, which is shared between Syria and Jordan, as well as then between Jordan and part of Israel. And the interesting fact is that in the 1997 agreement, which updated a previous agreement between Jordan and Syria, these two countries detailed how to allocate and govern the shared water resources of the Yarmouk River. However, this agreement only focuses on the surface water resources and not on the groundwater resources, as latest research confirmed, which explain partly why the Jordanian side has been receiving less than expected in terms of flow from the Yarmouk River. And the reason is that it did not really include in the agreement the groundwater resources of the basin, which apparently have been used upstream by Syria, resulting in a decrease also on the surface. I mean, I know that I'm speaking with many political geographers and geographers, so I'm sure you are probably more aware than I am on the interlinkages between groundwater and surface waters within basins. Then we have the 1994 agreement between Israel and Jordan as part of the peace treaty agreement between these two countries, which had also an annex and therefore details on the shared water resources. And finally, which basically are mainly partly of the Yarmouk River and the Jordan River between Lake Tiberias and the Dead Sea. And then the 2015 agreement between Jordan and Saudi Arabia on the groundwater resources non-renewable of the DC area, as we will see in a second. So this slide is quite important because it contextualizes really the water resources that we have in Jordan and how they're being used, and also why. So basically, the situation is that data from 2017, more or less, statistics from the Ministry of Water and Irrigation of Jordan, explain that about half of the water resources are being used for domestic uses, then 45% for agriculture, and about 3% for industry. In terms of resources, instead, we have 59% coming from surface water resources, 27% from groundwater, and 14% of treated wastewater. The interesting aspect, however, is to compare this data with the one on the right side, which shows that more than 50% of the water resources of the water supply in Jordan is coming from groundwater, and about 33% from surface water. And the reason here is, so the question would be why Jordan is using so much groundwater and so little in relative terms, obviously, surface water compared to the resources that it has. And the answer is is the previous slide. So the transboundary origin and nature of the most important surface water resources of Jordan, which basically are 3 rivers. 2 of them, the biggest ones, the Jordan and the Yarmouk River, are shared with neighboring countries, and therefore it's easier for Jordan to rely for its water supply to water resources that are entirely within Jordan, meaning groundwater resources. Obviously, not all of them are not shared like the DC is, but it's just easier to try to make the most of the groundwater resources, and that's why by overusing the groundwater resources, we have a situation where there is over extraction beyond the safe yield of the aquifers and of the groundwater resources, which therefore are resulting in a decrease in terms of quantity and quality of the groundwater resources. Agriculture, what is the role of agriculture? I mean, we saw briefly how much water they use. I mean, it uses the sector. But looking just more in detail, we can see here that in terms of GDP, some data confirm that agriculture contributes only 3% to the national GDP. However, it really depends what we include in this sector. No, I mean, if we include the whole supply chain or not. This 3% is without considering the whole supply chain, which obviously would increase to 15, 20, probably % if we included the whole supply chain. And also in terms of labor forces, about 3%. Obviously, the same applies to what I was saying about the supply chain inclusion or not. But this is very important because if we compare this data with the data of the previous slide, where we saw that about 45% of water goes to the agricultural sector, and also to the fact that about 90% of the food consumed in the country is imported. What someone could wonder is why do we give so much water to the agricultural sector? Is then the agricultural contribution to the economy and to the food security of the country is not that important. And also, I mean, one of the answers, and we will see and speak more about this, is that part of the agricultural products produced in the country are then exported, which is important, obviously, from an economic perspective to those working in the agribusiness sector. However, from a water perspective, following the principle of virtual water introduced by Professor Tony Allen, from a water perspective, it would probably make more sense for a water scarce country not to export its virtual water and therefore try to export products, but even including agricultural products for whose production they are not very water intensive, and therefore try to import, which is what Jordan is doing, import mainly agricultural products from abroad, and try not to export much virtual water. I mean, this one from a water perspective, obviously there's other considerations that needs to be accounted for when it comes to food security, water security, etc., because it's not just about counting and calculating how much virtual water we're importing and exporting. It's also a matter of trust. How much do we trust the international market or the countries from which we are importing these products? So importance of diversifying, etc. So I think it's much more complex, but I think it's just interesting to just briefly mention the important role of agriculture in Jordan. So going back to the core research and presentation, which is on the politics of water scarcity in Jordan. Here is the research question that has been guiding this research, this project, which is how is the discourse of water scarcity constructed in the case of Jordan? So, I mean, obviously coming more from a constructivist perspective, I adopted a qualitative methodology looking both at written documentation, mainly by media, governmental reports, national strategies and policies on water, donors and international organizations reports on water in Jordan, academic literature on this issue of water scarcity in Jordan, and finally also the textbooks, which I found very useful to try to understand how the issue of water scarcity is framed in the curricula. So how students and the younger population in Jordan grows up learning about the challenge of water scarcity. So this was the written documentation, then semi-structured interviews to all the relevant people that contributed to produce these reports and what I just mentioned, but also those involved in policy making, journalists, academics, so different variety of experts interview mainly, and then observation of how policymakers and key people speak about the issue of water scarcity, for instance, in conferences or in international conferences. And finally, some focus groups, both at the beginning and at the end of the project, to really try to find what are the discourses and narratives about the issue of water scarcity. And at the end, it's also to try to test the findings to see whether they are in line with what with the discussions that emerged in the focus groups. So the main finding was that everyone agrees on the fact that there is water scarcity, and water scarcity is a challenge in the case of Jordan. So this is something that was agreed basically by everyone I spoke and I met during this project. However, the main difference and the interesting aspect was the nuances on the key causes behind the challenge of water scarcity. And so I divided this discourse in two parts. The first one, which is the one on the left, I call the water insufficiency narrative, which basically really, or I mean, we can also call it sub-discourse, but the point is that people that, firstly, it's bigger because it's the more dominant one. It's the one that you would probably read more about in newspapers, in the mainstream outlets, textbooks, writings, and publications. So that's why it's bigger. And what this sub-discourse or narrative argues is that there is water scarcity in Jordan due to the limited water resources that we have. And therefore, the solution that this narrative drives is basically that we have limited water resources, and in order to solve this problem, we need to increase the water resources in order to try to manage to ensure water security and manage to meet and match the growing demand. And the four reasons behind and building this water scarcity and insufficiency narrative is that we have water scarcity, firstly, due to population growth, immigration, and refugees. So the population of Jordan has been growing. We had a population of about less than 500,000 people in 1946 when Jordan became an independent state. And then it grew up to about 7 million about 15 years ago. And then today we have a population of almost 11 million. So obviously having 3-4 million, suddenly, like in 5-7 years, it's a growing challenge because it increases the water demand. And so this is perceived as an important reason why we have water scarcity in the country. And obviously, this population growth is also partly driven by numbers of refugees that moved to Jordan from neighboring countries, from the region, following conflicts or instability or civil unrest in their countries. Over time, we probably all can think of refugees mainly coming from Palestine, following different wars over the years between Israel and Arab countries, or Israel and Palestine, following wars that took place in Iraq and more recently also in Syria. The other reason is the unfair sharing with neighboring countries. So there is a perception in Jordan that the sharing of the transboundary water resources is not fair towards Jordan. Obviously, this also depends who you speak with. When I spoke with some people, especially in the government, emphasized certain relations. For instance, over the years on the Yarmouk River with Syria, while others that I spoke with emphasized the relations with Israel. And so basically they will argue we have limited water resources because the neighboring countries are stealing our water, or they're not giving us our fair share. So that's more or less the kind of the causes. The other two instead blame mainly the environment. So on the one hand, the climate change that is putting an additional pressure on already the very challenges that we have in the water sector in different ways, obviously, like different kind of precipitation, lower precipitation, or precipitation more concentrated, but also the impact on the groundwater resources recharge. And the other one is aridity and low precipitation. So there is a perception that Jordan, which I mean, for a large part of its territory is quite arid and desertic, that it's quite natural to have water scarcity because there's low precipitation and it's an arid country situated in the Middle East, which is perceived as being quite of a water scarce region. So all these four reasons and causes drive towards the fact that we have limited water resources due to either external factor, so either the environment and the nature, or to neighboring countries, or to especially refugees or immigration, so people coming from abroad. So it's really trying to externalize the blame towards other people and not to Jordan, the Jordanians, or the government. Well, I mean, we can also say that this kind of narrative is mainly very, very present in governmental reports and mainstream newspaper and mass media. The other one, instead, water mismanagement narrative, basically argues that there is water scarcity mainly due to the limited water resources which are mismanaged. So mainly due to the mismanagement of the water resources. So, and they would argue that if we better manage our water resources, we would not be in this situation. This narrative is mainly appearing in conversation or in writing of some academics, especially not based in the country, and mainly in NGOs and donors and international organizations writings and reports. And the three causes that are emphasized usually are non-revenue water due to leakages and physical losses, non-revenue water due to illegal wells and illegal uses and connections, and finally the so-called unsustainable agricultural water use, mainly due to unsustainable in terms of both type of crops. So basically crops that people would argue are not the ideal for water scarce and arid regions. For instance, maybe bananas, tomatoes, watermelons. So they're they use a lot of water, and then often these products are then also exported. So it does not make much sense to use a lot of your water to then export this product. And yes, and then also the tariffing. So maybe the suggestion on increasing the water tariffing, especially for agricultural sector. We will look at it in a second. And as we can see here, it's really these three reasons drive and blame mainly issues within the country. So either the management, the implementation of regulations, or the users, especially in the agricultural sector. However, it's also important to emphasize that they're not exclusive. So basically, when I speak with people, they all would agree that all these 7 reasons contribute to water scarcity. They would just emphasize more certain aspects rather than others, or they emphasize the others. So that's also an important nuance and to that the source mentioned. But what about the solutions? So the solutions are briefly mentioned. So when it comes to the first narrative, water insufficiency, limited water resources, the solution usually is, and therefore we need to increase the water supply. How? We will look at it in the next slide. The other narrative that emphasizes water mismanagement, the consequence is that the solutions that we need are simply on the demand side, so better manage the water resources. So let's by looking into the demand side. Now we will look more at the key solutions that are being suggested or have been suggested. So first one is on the transboundary aspect and side. we need, there is this project proposal of the Dead Sea Canal project, which is an old project version that has been discussed. I published an article on this in Water International, but basically, since the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan back in 1994, in the years after that, discussions about the possibility of having a joint project, also supported back in the days by the World Bank, has been suggested and discussed. This version has changed many times. Lately, Jordan is considering building a national water project or career that would desalinize water in Aqaba. So the idea behind this project is the one that is currently happening, according to Jordan at least, is desalinize water in Aqaba and then pump this water up to Amman and the northern part of the country, 300 kilometers more or less north, which is where most of the population lives. So that's the current status of the project. However, there's different versions. The previous one was like a regional project bringing Israel, Palestine, and Jordan together in order to desalinize water in Aqaba, so in southern Jordan, near on the Red Sea, sell this water to Israel in the southern part of the country, and then Israel would sell water to the Palestinians in the West Bank, and then Jordan would get water from the north, from Tiberiade Lake, from Israel, directly towards Amman and the northern part of the country. With also an aspect of, one of the proposals also like to work on hydropower plants or renewable energy in terms of solar. The project has been changing very fastly, and so just this week also an agreement was signed between Israel, Jordan, and the Emirates in order to promote renewable energy plant, solar plant in southern Jordan, energy that would then be sold to Israel, and then Israel would sell water to northern Jordan. But we need to wait and see the implementation, in which direction things will go. But in general, potential of benefits is really to increase the amount of water in Jordan. And then depending on which perspective you take, sealing the Dead Sea used to be an important aspect of this project, but then currently it's not really going to benefit the Dead Sea directly. Interdependency between regional, different countries in the region, that can be seen or not as a benefit. It really depends on the political stance and the political perspective that you look at this project. And then peace and stronger regional ties. Coming from IR, coming maybe from a liberal school, then that probably would make sense, no? Like regional institutions, and but also here, it really depends. What does peace mean? Peace for whom? What does cooperation mean? Who does the cooperation help, include, exclude, etc. So there's really different potential benefits, but also potential challenges, no? In terms of funding, in terms of trust between countries and people, relying on neighboring countries for own water security. That could be good or bad, depending on the relations and the trust and the between different countries. And also water versus food security. The DC Canal project is the project that is currently that is operational. So basically, Jordan is pumping water from the southern part of the country to the north, using since 2015 the DC aquifer, which is a transboundary aquifer, non-renewable nature. Yes, and in 2015, as I mentioned earlier, an agreement has been signed between Jordan and Saudi Arabia on the use of the DC aquifer. Treated wastewater, which is something that is really being promoted and supported by everyone in the country, including the donors, and it aims really to increase the use of treated wastewater to agriculture, especially in the Jordan Valley. However, farmers are experiencing a decrease in the quality of water, and therefore they're not that big concerned to some extent on this aspect, because it's impacting negatively their farms. And yes, so non-revenue water, big challenge. Leakages and illegal wells campaigns has been launched in 2014 by the former Minister of Water and Irrigation. It has been successful to some extent, but the real challenge is really monitoring and in enforcing and implementing the regulation, especially in the northern part of the country, where there's a lot of small farms. Therefore, it's more challenging. While in the southern part of the country, where the DC aquifer lies, it was easier to implement the regulations, because there were basically 4 large agribusinesses. And so it was just much easier to make decisions and decide to transfer water from there to the northern part of the country, reduce or close the agribusinesses, etc., etc. Tariff subsidies removal and regulations on crops. It has also been something that George. So this is all on the demand side, no? It has been challenging because of the role that farmers and rural communities have in Jordan, which is an important role in the public sector and in the country. They are like an important and influential player, and therefore it's difficult for a government to try to go against the agricultural and rural communities. And therefore, I mean, while they tried, for example, to some extent, to increase the water tariffs in the past decades, this often was then amended in the parliament, where the rural communities are well represented, and therefore it's quite challenging to pass new regulations or implement support subsidies removal, etc., etc. Even if, obviously, I mean, something that the donors have been pushing for. Conservation, so try to increase and conserve more water resources. It's something that has been supported by everyone, and it's being done. I published an article on the analysis of the textbooks in Jordan and the educational policy. So basically, conservation means increasing awareness, raise awareness through, for instance, education, through also trainings that, for instance, SDC, the Swiss, have been doing, and other donors to targeting water, targeting journalists. And so, for instance, they did this Water Journalism Academy and different webinars and seminars on targeting really journalists to try to discuss water issues and challenges with them. And then also some trainings to inform about the importance of saving water, also from a religious perspective, trying to involve also religious leaders. So, I mean, getting to the conclusion, here are some questions for the reflection and discussion that we could have. So it's really important, I believe, in this case, but also in general, to think and reflect on what is implemented, what is not, and why. So the why, it's really the question that allows us to unpack political economy questions. So should we increase the supply to meet the demand and maintain the status quo, which means which is easier, because maintaining the status quo, it means that you're not challenging benefits of groups that are benefiting from the current status quo. Challenge the status quo, redistribution and sustainable water use. It's also another option, but obviously more politically challenging to challenge the status quo, because you challenge those benefiting from the current distributions. Reallocations from rural to urban areas, which obviously undermines often communities, rural communities. And so the question is really, which interests do the different solutions undermine and challenge? What should the role of agriculture be? How should Jordan balance water and food security while also ensuring rural development and jobs creation? But going to the conclusion here, I mean, we need to holistically understand the problem, which is what I try to do, to be able to solve it. So before trying to go into the solutions, it's very important to try to unpack and understand what is the problem and how is the problem created. We need to support interdisciplinary research for complex problems. We are all probably familiar with the nexus, so water, energy, food nexus is probably the most famous one, considering also rural development, jobs, and migration, though. We need to contextualize water issues within the political economy and the broader context. And then finally, how should the Jordanian economy look like in the long term How can we arrive at? And is there a need for a paradigm change? What are the conditions to facilitate such transition? And this links to the role of agriculture, for instance. How do we want to keep ensuring food security and water security while also preserving the environment? So those are the key challenges and questions that I think we should really try to look into. Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. And now back to you, Isabel, I believe.
Yes. Thank you, Hussam. Thank you for your presentation. And before we jump to the questions, I would like to ask Henrique to step up. Henrique is doing an overview of a presentation in Portuguese. And as soon as he finishes, we will go to the questions that we are collecting right now. Henrique?
Obrigado, Isabela. Obrigado, professor Hussam. Então, como a Isabela falou, eu vou fazer um breve resumo da fala do professor Hussam em português. O tema foi a política da escassez de água na Jordânia, e que ele colocou que a região como um todo, né, perto da Jordânia, o Oriente Médio, é a região com maior escassez de água do planeta, e com a Jordânia sendo o segundo país com maior escassez de água no mundo. Ele colocou alguns dados interessantes, que, por exemplo, 35% da população da Jordânia é formada por refugiados, e que 90% dos produtos são importados. E 50% do uso da água na Jordânia, quase 50% do uso, vai para a agricultura. Então, a partir desses dados, ele começou a falar um pouco sobre alguns dos problemas, como os problemas políticos também estão relacionados com esses problemas da escassez de água por lá. Ele falou sobre a degradação ambiental que vem acontecendo nos últimos anos na região, principalmente por uma superexploração da água subterrânea e uma diminuição, o que leva, por exemplo, a uma diminuição do fluxo do Rio Jordão, que é um dos principais rios da região, o que acaba impactando também a biodiversidade de lá. Ele colocou também que, por exemplo, o Mar Morto teve 1/3 dele que já secou, e o nível de água nele segue diminuindo. Ele também coloca um dado muito interessante, que 40% das águas do país são transfronteiriças, divididas entre os vizinhos, que são a Síria, a Palestina, Israel, o Iraque e a Arábia Saudita. E tiveram alguns acordos sobre as águas do país no passado, só que quase todos são sobre as águas superficiais. Então, isso acaba acontecendo que 50% do uso de água da Jordânia vem das águas subterrâneas. E isso é por conta desses acordos que focam nas águas superficiais e acabam ignorando as águas subterrâneas. E as águas superficiais, então, elas acabam não sendo utilizadas por causa de todo esse conflito que gera por elas serem águas, 40% delas serem superficiais, serem transfronteiriças, desculpa. Apesar disso, apesar de um grande uso da água na Jordânia na agricultura, apenas 3% do PIB da Jordânia vem de agricultura e apenas 3% dos trabalhadores da Jordânia trabalham no setor da agricultura. A Jordânia, então, isso acontece porque a Jordânia tenta não exportar água virtual, né, já que é um recurso escasso por lá. E eles importam muita coisa pelo mesmo motivo. E daí o professor Hussam partiu para um debate de como a escassez de água foi construída no caso da Jordânia. Meio que todo mundo concorda que há escassez de água, mas há algumas nuances sobre o debate sobre essa escassez. Ele coloca 2 narrativas principais. A primeira, que ele coloca como a mais recorrente, é a narrativa da insuficiência hídrica, que leva em conta fatores externos, tenta externalizar a culpa da situação, como ele coloca. Então, coloca os fatores, por exemplo, das mudanças climáticas, da divisão desigual da água com os países vizinhos, do aumento populacional causado pela imigração, pelos refugiados, e também da precipitação, né, do clima, no fator geográfico mesmo, do clima árido, enfim, desértico da Jordânia e do Oriente Médio como um todo. E tem uma segunda narrativa, que é a narrativa do mau gerenciamento da água, que é uma narrativa que tenta colocar a culpa, na verdade, mais interna na Jordânia. Então, os argumentos dessa narrativa são um uso insustentável para a agricultura, por exemplo, uma má escolha do tipo de cultura que eles produzem por lá, culturas que usam muita água, ele deu o exemplo de banana, melancia, também perda de águas no transporte dessa água, então, por exemplo, vazamentos, e também usos ilegais da água pelo país. Depois disso, ele colocou algumas possíveis soluções para o problema. Uma das soluções para o problema da escassez é a construção de um canal entre o Mar Vermelho e o Mar Morto, que abasteceria a Jordânia com água, então. Isso teria benefícios como, por exemplo, uma relação fortalecida entre os países, trazer água, então, para a Jordânia, só que teria alguns problemas, por exemplo, também, como a dependência dos vizinhos, nesse caso específico, muito de Israel, né, por causa da fronteira, e também problemas do financiamento de como isso aconteceria. Outras soluções teriam o canal do Disse, que é um aquífero transfronteiriço dividido com a Arábia Saudita, então a construção de um canal para pegar a água desse aquífero. Soluções que passam também pelo tratamento da água, então aumentar o uso da água tratada para ser usada na agricultura, campanhas para monitoramento do uso legal de água, por exemplo, monitorar poços legais, que trazem desafios também no próprio monitoramento em si, regulamentação das culturas, de tarifas, remoções de subsídios, o que tem uma resistência muito forte da classe rural da Jordânia, e algumas soluções conservacionistas, como, por exemplo, aumentar a atenção que as pessoas têm por isso, através de educação e informação. Ele coloca algumas reflexões sobre o que deveria ser implementado, por quê, como isso deveria ser feito, e ele conclui falando que a solução para esse caso passa por soluções holísticas, que levem em conta aspectos interdisciplinares e que contextualizem também a situação política e econômica da Jordânia na região, e que pensem no futuro econômico da Jordânia para fazer um planejamento sobre como isso deve ser feito, pensando nisso. Acho que é mais ou menos por aí o que o professor Hussam trouxe na apresentação dele.
Thank you, Henrique. Thank you for doing this amazing overview. And now we are jumping to our questions. And Hussam, we received some of them and we already collected. And the first question, it is Jordan considering cooperating with the West Bank or Gaza in any capacity as well?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I mean, Jordan and Palestine have been, they have obviously relation, and the project in the past of, for instance, the idea of a Red Canal, which had a regional dimension. Jordan wanted Palestine to be one of the partners in this project. So the goal was really to have a regional cooperation. But obviously, as I was mentioning, the project now is changing shape, so it's probably not having a regional dimension anymore. But ideally, I believe that they would cooperate, and the challenge obviously is the question of ownership of water in the West Bank and Gaza, no? Because of the occupation, which obviously does not really allow direct cooperation over water between the two countries. But Jordan has been in the past decades pushing for inclusion of Palestine when discussing water issues. New water projects, at least when it came to the Red Canal, from my understanding.
Okay. And the next question is from Larry. And Larry is asking, how does the fractal interstate reality impact on Jordan's national level discourse on water security?
Yes, thank you, and nice to see you, Larry, here. So basically, my understanding of the question is, how does the regional conflict and the instability reality in the region impact the national discourse of water security in Jordan? I believe in different ways. Firstly, there's the issue of refugees, and therefore regional instability that then results in inflow of refugees into Jordan, which impacts the national water strategy and the long-term plans of Jordan for water security. We have seen this, for instance, when it came to the Syrian crisis, and the project of Jordan for the DC Canal project, which basically means pumping water from the south to north, which was supposed to be a short-term plan for Jordan, while then building the Red Canal project. The presence of refugees has changed the strategy, and Jordan therefore find itself often to have to cope with sudden changes and that happen, and therefore it's really difficult to follow the long-term strategies and plans that they set. That's one way. And the other way is by discussions. I mean, in both ways, discussions on the need for transboundary cooperation with neighboring countries, which really go in different directions, because following also regional political relations, and which are very dynamic in the region. So, for instance, going forward for regional project and cooperation with Israel, and then stopping, and so like it really depends on. And I mean, the water relations follow political relations between countries, so they're quite dynamic, let's say. And finally, also maybe in the case of the Yarmouk River, so relations with Syria, which have been changing a lot, and also like the flow of water coming into the country has changed over the past 10-15 years, following also the Syrian crisis, because due both to electricity cuts in southern Syria during the crisis, as well as less agriculture in the southern part of the country due to the civil war, or to the war, resulted in more water coming into the country. So like regional instabilities, regional politics plays a role and has impact also on the water dimension.
And Larry continues the questions, asking if virtual water cooperation might be a possibility.
I mean, depends what we mean with virtual water cooperation. Is it like import of virtual water? So I think it's already happening, if we mean that, no, by importing food, or like virtual meaning during a pandemic via Zoom, maybe. Right? But I think, yeah, I mean, virtual water cooperation. I mean, maybe more water imports of water. I think, yes, that's definitely a possibility which has been discussed, and I think that many senior Jordanian officials see this as one of the key way forwards to solve the water crisis in the country.
That was a good question. And we have one question from Professor Wagner. Professor Wagner is asking if Jordan is surrounded by several countries, but they all face difficulties in accessing water. In your analysis, did you identify any situation of hydrogemony of neighbors in relation to the country?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Wagner. So yes, I mean, being Jordan, a country that has shared water sources, transboundary rivers, definitely there are dimensions of hydrohegemony when it comes to relation with neighboring countries. And Jordan does not find itself as the hydrohegemon, but often has found itself as being the non-hydrohegemon. In particular, I mean, if we think of the Jordan River, which is shared by 5 countries, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. Israel has been, over the years, the hydrohegemon, meaning the most powerful country in terms of the different dimension of power, looking at hard power and bargaining power, and also ideational power, as Professor Zaytoun and Warner would describe. So definitely in the case of the Jordan basin, but also if you look at the Yarmouk river basin, in particular the relation between Jordan and Syria. Syria has been, since the 50s, since the first treaty, always the hydro hegemon in this bilateral relation versus Jordan. Not only because it's upstream, but also because it had more power in terms of, the different dimension of power that I mentioned. However, it's also interesting to see how this hydrohegemonic relation has been changing over the past years following the crisis since 2011 in Syria. The relation has been changing. Jordan has gained a bit more power, but we will see in the next 10 years whether this will also mean and be reflected in new discussions on the location of the Yarmouk River.
Okay. And finally, we have a question from Professor Luis Paulo. Luis is asking, how are the Jordan's water scarcity discourses connected with international epistemological networks?
Yes, thank you, Luis Paulo. Great question. This is also something that I Hussein, I'm looking at and starting to explore more, and I'm planning to work on this topic next year. In particular, really on how global discourses interact with or shape domestic and national discourses on water issues and hydropolitical dynamics. So obviously, there is an interaction. Global discourses and global norms shape also policies and discourses nationally. We can think, for instance, of the WEF Nexus, the WRM, but also discussions on climate change, the COP conferences, but also the SDG 6.5.2, which is exactly on supporting transboundary cooperation. So all these global norms, discourses, but also IW, like International Water Law, the convention. So all these norms and discourses and shape and inform and influence certainly global national discourses. And so I think it will be really interesting to see how this relation happens and how they are absorbed or understood or by national actors and therefore how they inform national discourses. That's super interesting. I'm planning to try to explore it next year. So yeah, if Luis Paulo, if you are interested, let's maybe keep in touch on this and discuss this topic in the next months.
We're looking forward to see how this discussion goes in the future. And Larry just made a comment that his questions about virtual water cooperation was in relation to the first question. Yes, so he means that in relation to the first question about Jordan-Palestine relations, maybe one way of getting water to Palestine is through trade in staple foods. Since most of water consumed is in food, this might relieve pressure on Palestine.
Yes, certainly I think, virtual water is a very, very important concept which can help in alleviating water challenges in water scarce countries, even more if under occupation, such as in the case of Palestine. Obviously this one needs to go hand in hand with also trying to discuss and solve hopefully the broader political challenge of the occupation. But certainly, virtual water cooperation is something that needs to be increased.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Hussein. These are all the questions that we have on here, and I would like to express my gratitude for you for joining us today and for doing this amazing presentation about a topic that is highly relevant. And for those that are watching us, I want to remember that our next episode of the GEOPO webinar series will be on December 8th with Flávia Darri Barbosa, and she will be talking about South American water governance, focused on the Paraguay River Basin. And I invite you all to watch and to follow our social media to stay tuned for updates regarding our work. So thank you, everyone, for being with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting. A pleasure.